Charleston, South Carolina, the year 1853, a city glittering with wealth built on the backs of enslaved people. To the outside world, Charleston was a jewel of the South. Grand mansions, elegant dinner parties, and booming trade flowing through its ports. But beneath that polished surface, something darker was unfolding. Over a span of months, some of the city's most powerful men began to die. A colonel, a judge, a ship captain, each man respected, wealthy, untouchable, each man suddenly struck down by what doctors at the time called apoplexy, or severe stroke. The deaths shocked Charleston, but not enough to cause alarm. After all, rich men died too, didn't they? But then came the funerals, burials at St. Michael's Cemetery, where Charleston's elite were laid to rest. Families wept, ministers prayed, and caskets were lowered into the ground. No one questioned the quiet stillness of the corpses. No one dared imagine what was really happening inside those wooden boxes once the earth was packed tight above them, because decades later, during a routine renovation of St. Michael's, workers pried open 9 old coffins. And what they found inside has haunted Charleston's history ever since. The bones told one story, but the coffins told another. Inside, the wood was clawed, scratched, shredded from the inside out. Marks of fingernails dragged desperately along the lid, gouging deep into the boards. Evidence that these men had not been dead at all when they were buried. They had been alive, paralyzed, helpless, fully conscious as the soil closed above them. Imagine it. You can't move. You can't scream. You hear the voices of your family weeping above your body. And then silence, darkness, hours stretching into eternity while you fight for breath in a coffin that is slowly, inevitably, stealing the last of your air. And this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic mistake. This was deliberate, methodical, calculated revenge. At the center of it all was one man, an enslaved assistant in a Charleston doctor's practice. His name was Solomon Fairfax. To most, he was invisible, just another slave, pouring mixtures and preparing instruments for a physician who treated Charleston's wealthy patients. But Solomon was watching, listening and planning, because years earlier his wife had been left to die, his children ripped from his arms and sold like cattle. 9 men, 9 powerful citizens of Charleston, had profited directly from his family's destruction. And Solomon, trained in medicine and chemistry, decided he would make them pay, not with bullets, not with blades, but with the very knowledge the system had given him. For nearly 2 years, Charleston whispered of what they called the prominent deaths phenomenon, a string of wealthy men taken suddenly by supposed illness. But only Solomon knew the truth, that these men weren't victims of natural fate. They were prisoners of his genius, victims of a paralytic compound so advanced that even trained doctors of the time couldn't detect it. It left its targets fully conscious, but locked inside their own bodies, and then buried alive. But here's the question that lingers, and the one we must wrestle with tonight. Was Solomon Fairfax a monster, a cold-blooded killer who inflicted unthinkable suffering, or was he something else? The only man brave enough to turn the system's own cruelty back upon its masters. Because when a society destroys your family and denies you justice, what choices remain? This is not just the story of one man's revenge. This is a story about morality, power, and the terrifying lengths to which desperation can drive the human spirit. Over the next 35 minutes, we'll uncover Solomon's methodical campaign of vengeance. We'll step inside the parlors of Charleston's elite, the kitchens where whispered intelligence passed from slave to slave, and the courtrooms where Solomon's trial forced the South to confront its own conscience. But it all begins with those coffins, 9 men clawing at their own deaths, 9 sets of fingernail marks etched into wood, proof that the whispers were true. Charleston, 1853, 9 powerful men buried alive, one enslaved man at the center of it all. And the question we cannot escape, was Solomon Fairfax a murderer, or a man delivering justice in the only way left to him? Before the world came to know him as Charleston's phantom avenger, Solomon Fairfax was just a man. An enslaved man, yes, but a man with a wife he adored and children who filled his days with laughter. To his family, Solomon was more than property. He was a father, a husband, a provider. The kind of man who carried water on his back and stories on his tongue. He believed, against all odds, that love could survive in a world built on chains. But slavery has a way of finding and crushing hope. For Solomon, the breaking point came in the summer of 1851. His owner, like many others, viewed enslaved families not as families at all, but as livestock to be sold, traded, discarded. Without warning, without mercy, Solomon's 2 children were taken from him. A boy of 6, a girl barely 4, both marched to an auction block where their tiny hands were pried from his grasp. He never saw them again. His wife, already weakened by fever, collapsed in grief. Days later, she was cast out into the roadside with no care, no medicine, no compassion. She died where she fell. And Solomon, shackled by law, by race, by a system that declared him less than human, could do nothing but remember. Those who knew him in the weeks after said something changed in Solomon's eyes. The warmth that once filled them had turned cold, like embers smothered beneath ash. He carried himself differently, still obedient when watched, still silent when spoken to. But inside, something new was being forged. They destroyed my family. They sold my children like cattle. They left my wife to die by the roadside. This is justice, not murder. Those words, whispered years later during his confession, captured the fire that was already burning in him. Yet what made Solomon unique was not just his grief, it was his knowledge. Unlike many enslaved men consigned to fields, Solomon had been chosen to work alongside a physician in Charleston. Day after day, he cleaned instruments, prepared tinctures, ground herbs into powders. He was not formally educated, but through quiet observation and sharp memory he learned. He studied the strange jars that lined the doctor's shelves, liquids that could heal or harm. He listened to the lectures, memorized the dosages, watched what happened when too much of one compound was given, or too little of another. Most importantly, he came to understand the thin line between medicine and poison. To his master, Solomon was just a pair of hands. But Solomon was a mind in waiting, and when his family was ripped from him, that mind turned toward vengeance. In Charleston's parlors, wealthy men toasted to their fortunes, never imagining that the quiet black assistant measuring powders behind the curtain was studying them as carefully as he studied his medicines. He knew their routines, their weaknesses, their trust in the doctor's mixtures. He knew that if he could slip one invisible alteration into a tonic, the result might not be immediate death, but something far worse: paralysis. Solomon's transformation was not sudden. It was the slow, grinding metamorphosis of grief sharpening into resolve. He began keeping notes in scraps of paper hidden in the rafters of his quarters. Formulas, trial measures, theories about herbs imported through Charleston's busy port. He tested mixtures on stray animals, watching as their bodies stiffened while their eyes still flickered with life. He adjusted ratios, refined doses, perfected the art of freezing the body while leaving the mind intact. He was not seeking to kill, not at first. He was seeking to make men feel what it meant to be powerless, to trap them inside their own flesh, the way he had been trapped inside the institution of slavery. Imagine his rage. Imagine the weight of those endless nights lying awake, hearing his wife's final cough echo in his memory, imagining his children's cries as they were dragged to some unknown plantation. While the city slept, Solomon was planning. While the bells of Charleston's churches tolled on Sundays, Solomon sat in the back pew, his eyes lowered, his mind calculating. By the time he was ready to act, he had become something no one expected. An enslaved man who had mastered chemistry better than the doctors who claimed authority over him. A man who knew exactly how to turn Charleston's blind trust in science into a weapon. But this was not random. He did not scatter his wrath blindly. He chose his targets with precision. Every name, every man he would later bring down, was connected by a common thread. They had all profited directly from the sale of his children or from the death of his wife. For Solomon, this was not murder. This was a ledger, and he was balancing it one name at a time. The city saw only a grieving slave who kept his head low. They did not see the mind sharpening behind those lowered eyes. They did not hear the vow that he whispered to himself in the quiet hours. They will know what it means to be trapped. They will know what it means to beg for mercy and receive none. When the first of Charleston's wealthy fell ill, no one suspected the quiet assistant in the background. Why would they? He was invisible, and that invisibility was his greatest weapon. But before the first nail was hammered into the coffin of his enemies, before the first scratch marks appeared inside those wooden boxes, Solomon Fairfax had already died once, the day his family was torn away. The man who rose from that loss was no longer just a slave. He was something else entirely, a survivor who had chosen to become an executioner. This was not random cruelty. It was grief transformed into vengeance. And as Charleston's streets glittered with wealth and laughter, a silent reckoning was already underway. One man's war against the very foundation of a city built on suffering. The first to fall was Colonel Robert Fitzpatrick, a man of great stature in Charleston society, decorated in the Mexican-American War, now retired and living off the profits of his sprawling plantation. He was the kind of man whose cane struck pavement with authority, whose voice silenced a room. He was also, unbeknownst to the city, one of the men responsible for Solomon Fairfax's grief. Fitzpatrick had brokered the auction that sold Solomon's children south to Louisiana. One humid August evening in 1852, Fitzpatrick visited his physician, complaining of a nervous trembling in his hands. The doctor, assisted by Solomon, prepared the usual tonic, a mixture of valerian root and laudanum. To Fitzpatrick it was a trusted cure. To Solomon it was an opportunity. As he ground the powders and poured the dark syrup, Solomon slipped in the substance he had perfected through months of trial, a paralytic compound extracted from imported plants, refined to appear colorless, odorless, undetectable. He handed it over with calm, practiced obedience. That night Fitzpatrick collapsed in his study. His servants rushed to his side, but found him unable to move, unable to speak. His eyes darted wildly, tears streaming down his face, but no words came. Within hours he was declared dead. His coffin was lowered into St. Michael's, and the city mourned another wealthy son. But inside that coffin, Robert Fitzpatrick was very much alive. He clawed desperately at the lid, tearing at the wood until his fingers broke. The earth pressed down, the air thinned, and eventually silence came. Weeks later, a man passing the cemetery at night swore he heard muffled scratching beneath the soil. He laughed it off as imagination, but Solomon knew. Solomon had been there, watching the burial, recording every detail. That night, by candlelight, he opened the small leather-bound journal he kept hidden beneath a floorboard. In steady handwriting he wrote, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has been judged. The same hands that sold my children now claw against his coffin. This is not murder. This is justice." For Solomon, this was the beginning. The ledger had one name crossed out. Many more remained. The second name was Judge Horace Calverton, a towering figure in Charleston's legal world. Calverton prided himself on harsh sentences, especially for enslaved people who dared resist. He had overseen the proceedings that allowed Solomon's wife to be cast out without recourse, condemning her to die by the roadside. To him, the law was a weapon, not a shield. In December of that year, Calverton too sought medical treatment. He suffered migraines that left him bedridden. Dr. Hathaway, the physician Solomon assisted, prepared the usual powders. But this time Solomon miscalculated. He had meant to administer a dose that would fully paralyze while leaving the mind intact. Instead, the balance tipped too far. Within minutes of drinking, Calverton convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back, foam gathering at his lips. For the first time, Solomon felt a flicker of fear. Had he gone too far? Dr. Hathaway bent over the judge, frantic, muttering that something was wrong, that the reaction was not consistent with apoplexy. His eyes narrowed briefly at Solomon, who stood silently at his side. But in the end, the doctor shook his head and declared it a sudden seizure. Another mysterious death. Another wealthy man carried to St. Michael's. But this time, the burial did not go as planned. As mourners filed away, a young journalist named Thomas Grimby lingered near the graveside. Grimby was not wealthy, nor was he powerful, but he had the instincts of a man who saw patterns where others saw accidents. He carried a small notebook with him always, and into it he scribbled a phrase: 2 great men dead in 4 months, both sudden, both treated by the same physician. Solomon noticed him. The way Grimby's eyes lingered, the way his pencil scratched furiously. And that night, his journal entry reflected his unease. Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice. But I fear others are beginning to notice patterns. For Solomon, this was not a cause to stop. It was a challenge to refine. He could not allow mistakes to betray him. His science had to be perfect, his methods invisible. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Charleston's drawing rooms and taverns. 9 months earlier, Fitzpatrick's death had been tragic but explainable. Now, with Judge Calverton gone so suddenly, rumor took root. Some called it divine punishment, others muttered about curses. But the phrase that began circulating was simple, ominous, and unforgettable: the prominent deaths phenomenon. At first, it was spoken in hushed voices, with nervous laughter to mask the fear. But soon it was on everyone's lips. How many more? Who next? Was there some hidden sickness stalking Charleston's elite? Behind closed doors, men of wealth grew uneasy. Their physicians were summoned more often, their tonics consumed with caution. Some even whispered of poisoning, though none dared accuse openly. Not yet. Grimby, the journalist, sharpened his suspicions. He began following funerals, watching who attended, listening to which names were whispered with dread. He noted Solomon's presence, always silent, always hovering near the doctor. To Grimby, patterns mattered, and the pattern was tightening. Inside Solomon's world, the killings were both science and scripture. Each entry in his journal read like a psalm of vengeance, precise and cold. Dosages measured, reactions recorded, names crossed from his private list. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an executioner, delivering divine symmetry to an unjust world. And yet, he knew eyes were beginning to turn. Grimby's notebook scratched on. The doctor's moment of suspicion lingered in Solomon's memory. The city was restless. Still, the ledger was not finished. Fitzpatrick, Calverton, 2 names gone. 7 remained. And so, Charleston braced for what no one yet understood. The beginning of a silent storm. A man invisible to the city's powerful was pulling them down one by one. And the whispers of the prominent deaths phenomenon would soon grow into terror. By the spring of 1853, Charleston's whispers had grown louder. 2 prominent men gone in less than a year, both victims of strange, sudden seizures. The phrase prominent deaths phenomenon was now spoken not in jest, but in unease. Still, the city had no proof, no hand to point to, no trail of evidence. For Solomon Fairfax, this was both safety and danger. His plan was unfolding, name by name, but he knew whispers were dangerous things. If they grew too loud, they could become accusations. The next name on his list was Captain William Dandridge. Dandridge was not a planter like Fitzpatrick, nor a judge like Calverton. He was a sea captain, wealthy from the shipping trade that carried rice and cotton from Charleston's harbor to the world. Dandridge had purchased Solomon's son at auction, a 6-year-old boy who vanished into the labyrinth of the Gulf trade. To Solomon, Dandridge was not just guilty. He was personal, but this death would not happen quietly in a study or a sickbed. This time, fate set the stage for something far more dramatic. In May of 1853, Captain Dandridge hosted a grand dinner party at his home overlooking the harbor. 12 men of Charleston's elite gathered at his table, dining on roasted pheasant, spiced oysters, and Madeira wine. Their wives and daughters lingered in adjoining rooms, the air thick with laughter, music, and cigar smoke. What no one noticed was the extra pair of hands in the kitchen that night. A tall, quiet man assisting the house cook, carrying trays, arranging silver. Few bothered to ask his name. To them, he was just another servant. But it was Solomon. He had slipped into the rotation of rented kitchen staff, invisible as always. He moved carefully, deliberately, timing his moment. He did not touch the wine, too risky, too obvious. Instead, he turned his attention to the dessert. A custard pudding, golden and sweet, the final dish of the evening. Into one portion, he folded a measured trace of his compound, hidden beneath nutmeg and sugar, Captain Dandridge's portion. The dining room sparkled with conversation as dessert was served. Dandridge lifted his spoon, laughing at a joke, completely unaware. One bite, two, three, then silence. The captain's hand froze mid-air. His spoon clattered to the table. His eyes widened, panic flickering in them, before his body stiffened and collapsed backward. Chairs scraped, shouts rang out, women screamed. 12 witnesses leapt to their feet, crowding the fallen man. Dr. Hathaway, seated at the table as one of the honored guests, rushed forward. He bent over Dandridge, fingers pressed to his neck, eyes darting across the rigid body. This was no ordinary seizure. The onset was too sudden, the symptoms too precise. For the first time, he dared whisper the thought that had haunted him since Judge Calverton: poison. The room was chaos, wine spilled, dishes shattered, guests stumbling over one another. In the adjoining hall, Solomon slipped silently out, tray still in hand, his eyes down, blending with the servants rushing in panic. No one stopped him. No one saw the calm precision beneath his mask, but this time, things were different. Instead of silence, Solomon got panic. Instead of secrecy, he got exposure. For the first time, his mask slipped. The very next morning, Charleston erupted in rumor. Dandridge had not died in the privacy of his bed, but in full view of the city's most powerful men. And Dr. Hathaway, though cautious with his words, could not hide his unease. "I have reason," he said quietly to a colleague, "to suspect these deaths are not natural." The words spread like fire through dry grass. By evening, the newspapers carried the headline, "Prominent Captain Dead at Table, Mysterious Malady Claims Third Victim." And in the margins of that paper, Thomas Grimby's pencil scratched furiously. Grimby had been at the cemetery. He had spoken with undertakers. He had seen the faint scratches in the lid of Fitzpatrick's coffin when it shifted during repairs. He had interviewed servants who whispered of strange powders, of Solomon's quiet presence at every death. And now he had confirmation. Solomon Fairfax had been in Dandridge's house the very night the captain died. In his notebook, Grimby drew 3 names linked by lines: Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge. Beneath them, one word: Fairfax. That night Solomon returned to his quarters, hands trembling for the first time since his campaign began. He opened his journal by candlelight, but the lines did not flow as smoothly. His words were sharper, clipped, burdened with urgency. "Captain Dandridge is gone. His hand that tore my son from me now stiffens in death. But the city trembles. The doctor suspects. Grimby watches. The ledger must close soon, before I am unmasked." For the first time, fear crept into Solomon's entries. He had always seen himself as untouchable, hidden by invisibility, shielded by the arrogance of Charleston's wealthy who never looked at the enslaved. But now the pattern was undeniable. In the streets, children whispered of a shadow killing the rich. Merchants prayed aloud that they would not be next. Women fainted at supper tables when their husbands coughed too long. Servants traded stories in kitchens of masters clawing in their coffins, of a dark angel passing through Charleston. The ledger was not yet complete. But Solomon knew his time was running out. The city no longer dismissed the whispers. They were certain now. Something unnatural was happening. And though no one could yet prove it, suspicion had found a shape. A man with quiet hands, always nearby, always watching. The storm was gathering. And Solomon Fairfax, once invisible, was about to step into its center. By the summer of 1853, Charleston was no longer whispering. It was trembling. 3 prominent men were dead, all under mysterious circumstances, and fear had infected the city like a plague. Merchants cancelled gatherings, judges refused dinner invitations, and physicians were harassed in the streets with questions they could not answer. The prominent deaths phenomenon was no longer rumor. It was terror, and at the center of it, Solomon Fairfax prepared for his final strike. This time, it would not be one man in a coffin. This time, it would be a reckoning. The last names on Solomon's hidden ledger were 6 slave traders, men who had bought, sold, and profited from the flesh of human beings. These were not distant figures to him. They were the very men who had profited from the sale of his children. Each had sat on the auction block while his son and daughter were paraded like livestock. Each had laughed, bargained, raised their bids. Killing them one by one would take too long. And after Dandridge's very public collapse, Solomon knew he no longer had time. He would have to strike once, and strike decisively. On the evening of July 14th, 1853, the 6 men gathered in a private parlor above a counting house just blocks from Charleston's busy harbor. They drank brandy, smoked cigars, and congratulated themselves on a profitable season of trade. None noticed the man tending the gas lamps overhead. Solomon had secured entry as a hired attendant, carrying tools and oil for the lamps. The men barely looked at him. Why would they? To them, he was just another shadow. But Solomon had altered the lamps. Instead of harmless gas, they hissed with a vapor he had refined, an airborne version of his paralytic compound. As the men laughed and toasted, the invisible poison filled the air, seeping into their lungs with every breath. One by one, the laughter faltered. One by one, glasses slipped from fingers. A cigar rolled across the floor. And then silence. 6 men sat frozen in their chairs, eyes wide, bodies rigid, mouths unable to scream. Only their eyes moved, darting, terrified, following the tall, quiet figure who stepped forward into the center of the room, Solomon. He looked at them for a long moment, then spoke softly, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime's grief. You traded lives as if they were nothing. You tore children from mothers, husbands from wives. You built your fortune on misery. And now you will taste helplessness. You will know what it is to be trapped, as my children were trapped. As I was trapped, the men's eyes bulged, straining against the paralysis. Tears streaked their faces. Their bodies remained rigid, prisoners in their own flesh. Solomon moved slowly between them, studying their terror, his own expression unreadable. This was not rage, it was ritual. Justice in the only form the world had left to him. But as he spoke, the door creaked open. Thomas Grimby, notebook in hand, eyes wide, chest heaving. He had followed whispers, tracked movements, connected patterns. And now, at last, he had found the truth. For a moment the 2 men stared at one another, the journalist and the executioner. Truth and justice colliding in a single room. Grimby's voice trembled, but it carried conviction. My God, and it's you. All this time. You've killed them. You've killed them all. Solomon did not flinch. He stepped toward Grimby, stopping only a few feet away, the paralyzed men's eyes flicking desperately between them. I gave them what they gave us, Solomon said quietly. Powerlessness, fear, silence. Do you call that murder or justice? Grimby shook his head, torn between horror and fascination. He had seen death before, but never like this. Never with such calculated purpose. You can't win this way. They'll call you a monster. They'll erase your story. And Solomon, with the faintest trace of a smile, answered, I'm not running. Let them come. Maybe when this story spreads, others will understand that even slaves have limits to what they'll endure in silence. At that moment, the clamor of boots echoed on the stairs. The authorities had been alerted, perhaps by Grimby's trail of questions, perhaps by servants who had noticed too much. The door burst open, armed men pouring into the room. The scene froze them in their tracks. 6 of Charleston's most powerful traders sat paralyzed, eyes rolling in silent terror. And standing calmly among them was Solomon Fairfax, unarmed, his hands raised not in surrender, but in defiance. Take me, he said simply. The officers hesitated. unnerved by the tableau. Then shouting, they surged forward, dragging Solomon down, shackling his wrists, forcing him to the ground. The 6 men gasped as air returned to their lungs, their paralysis easing, though their bodies trembled with lingering shock. They shouted for vengeance, demanded Solomon's death, screamed his name like a curse. But Solomon did not resist. He only looked at Grimby, who stood frozen in the doorway, notebook clutched tight in his hand. "Write it down," Solomon whispered as they hauled him away. "Tell them what you saw." And with that, the campaign of Charleston's Phantom Avenger came to an end. Solomon Fairfax, the man who buried 9 alive, was captured, bound, and delivered into the very system he had spent his life defying. But his story had only just begun to spread. The arrest of Solomon Fairfax sent shockwaves through Charleston. Within hours of his capture, the city's newspapers blazed with headlines of horror and fascination. Slave healer turned killer, 9 buried alive, Avenger unmasked. The mystery that had haunted the city for 2 years was over, but the story had only just begun. The 6 men Solomon had attempted to kill at the gaslit parlor survived, though some suffered lingering weakness from the paralytic vapor. They emerged from their chairs pale, shaking, and forever changed. In private, they swore vengeance. In public, they performed outrage and fear. And when the trial began only weeks later, they were its star witnesses. The courthouse overflowed with spectators. Planters, merchants, ministers, house servants, free black workers, northern journalists. Everyone came to witness the trial of the man who had defied Charleston's elite. Outside, newspapers sold out within minutes. Some painted Solomon as a demon, others as a folk hero. But inside the courtroom, he was simply a defendant in chains. From the very first day, Solomon appeared calm, almost serene. He sat straight-backed, hands folded, eyes fixed not on the judge or jury, but on the faces of those who had come to see him condemned. If there was fear in him, he hid it well. The prosecution built its case with precision. They laid out the timeline of the prominent deaths phenomenon, connected each victim to Solomon's presence, and produced the leather journal found in his quarters. Its pages, neat and meticulous, documented every step of his campaign. The entries were read aloud in a tense courtroom, words like surgical incisions. Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain. Each line, meant for his own private reckoning, now became the rope around his neck. The survivors took the stand one by one. Colonel Fitzpatrick could not. He lay buried, one of the 9. But Judge Marcus Calverton hobbled forward, his face drawn and grey from the near-fatal dosage that had left him partially paralyzed. His voice trembled as he described the experience. "I could see the coffin lid inches from my face," he whispered to the court. "I could hear the shovels, the dirt. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down. But I could not move. I could not scream. I lay there for hours, certain I was already dead." Another testified of the paralysis at the dinner party, of the invisible hand that had seized his body while his mind remained trapped inside. Their descriptions chilled the room. Even the jurors shifted uneasily, as though glimpsing a nightmare they would never forget. But when Solomon was invited to cross-examine them, he did not ask questions. He simply rose, looked at each man in turn, and spoke quietly. "I gave you hours," he said. "My children were given no chance at all." The judge struck his gavel for silence, but the words hung in the air like smoke. When it came time for Solomon's defense, his appointed lawyer offered the only strategy available: plead insanity. No sane man, the argument went, could orchestrate such horrors with such precision. But Solomon refused. He rose slowly from his seat, chains rattling at his wrists, and addressed the court himself. "They call me insane," he said, his voice steady. "But I am more sane than any man in this room. I was taught to heal, to ease pain, to preserve life. But those same skills, your skills, were used to break families, to profit from suffering, to destroy everything I loved. They sold my children like cattle. They left my wife to die by the roadside. This is justice, not murder. He paused, eyes sweeping over the jury, the judge, the rows of spectators. You ask why a healer became an executioner. You need only look in the mirror. My knowledge came from your books. My patience came from your discipline. My rage came from your cruelty. And now you call me criminal, as if the system that made me does not stand accused beside me. His words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Some spectators wept silently. Others hissed, calling him a monster. The judge ordered the gallery cleared twice that day. But Solomon remained composed, every word measured, every gaze deliberate. After 3 days of testimony, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. On the morning of his execution, July 31st, 1853, the streets of Charleston were lined with onlookers. Some jeered, some prayed, some stood in stunned silence, unable to decide what he was, villain or martyr. Solomon walked to the gallows without hesitation. He wore a plain linen shirt, shackles at his wrists and no hood. The executioner read the charges aloud, but his voice trembled under Solomon's gaze. At the foot of the scaffold, Solomon stopped and turned to the crowd. His eyes found Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had once stood frozen in the doorway of the parlor, notebook in hand. Grimby raised his pen now, ready to capture every word. Solomon mounted the steps, chains clinking softly. At the top, he turned to face the city one final time. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried to the edges of the square. I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt, he said. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. He looked skyward, then down at the crowd. You will forget my name. You will call me a monster. But somewhere, a father will whisper to his child that once there was a man who refused to suffer in silence. And maybe that child will grow up knowing that even in chains we are not powerless. The hangman slipped the rope around his neck. The square went silent. Solomon closed his eyes, and with one final breath he whispered, Celia, Marcus, Samuel, Grace. The trapdoor fell. Solomon Fairfax's body swung in the humid Charleston air that morning, but his story did not die with him. Some say Thomas Grimby's articles, smuggled north, became an early spark in the abolitionist movement. Others say it was just a ghost story Charleston told itself to explain 9 scratched coffins. But for those who heard his name, Solomon Fairfax became a question that refused to be buried. When the law defends injustice, what is justice? The execution of Solomon Fairfax did not silence his story. If anything, it spread it further. An ember carried on the wind, igniting whispers far beyond Charleston. In the months that followed, planters across the South began to check their food twice before eating. Gas lamps were inspected obsessively. Kitchens turned upside down in paranoia. A single man had shaken the confidence of a system that believed itself untouchable. Among physicians, too, the case left its mark. Doctors studying Judge Calverton's paralysis began documenting locked-in states more rigorously. Hospitals quietly rewrote their manuals on poison and antidotes. And coroners, who had long dismissed slave deaths without inquiry, suddenly found themselves under pressure to look deeper, to rule out invisible agents. A folk legend had pushed medicine forward, though few dared say his name aloud. But the greatest change came not from science, but from silence. Charleston's courts ordered Solomon's journals destroyed. Newspapers were censored. Records of the trial were locked away, labeled unfit for public consumption. For decades, the official line was simple: no such man ever existed. And yet, truth has a way of surviving. Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had seen Solomon face the men he paralyzed, never forgot what he witnessed. In his later years, long after leaving Charleston, he wrote a private memoir. Within it, he copied passages from Solomon's journal, the same entries the court had tried to erase, and described the night he watched 6 of Charleston's most powerful men sit helpless in their chairs. Eyes wide, as Solomon declared that even the enslaved had limits. Grimby never published that memoir in his lifetime. He feared it would be dismissed, or worse, used as justification for further cruelty. Instead, he buried it, literally. His notes and a small leather-bound book were sealed in a tin box and placed beneath the roots of a magnolia tree in his family's yard. There it lay, untouched, for 70 years. In 1923, during routine cemetery renovations in Charleston, workers made a grim discovery. Old coffins were being relocated, and when they pried open the decayed wood, they found something that chilled them to the bone. Deep scratch marks carved into the underside of the lids. Fingernail grooves, desperate and ragged, evidence that at least some of the dead had been buried alive. The story leaked to the local press, stirring the embers of an old rumor. Was this the proof that the legend of Solomon Fairfax was not just a ghost story, but history? That same year, Grimby's memoir resurfaced, unearthed by his descendants when the magnolia tree in his yard was cut down. Inside the rusted tin were the copied journal entries, yellowed but legible. One line stood out above all others, written in Solomon's steady hand: "I am not cruel. Cruelty belongs to those who made me. I'm only the echo of what they created. The records remain fragmented." Historians still debate whether Solomon Fairfax was fact or folklore, a single man or the embodiment of many whispered tales of resistance. The scratched coffins are real. The journals exist. But the truth of the man himself, his face, his voice, remains in shadows, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps Solomon is less a man than a mirror, forcing us to confront the question that unsettled Charleston in 1853 and still unsettles us today. Was he justified? Or was he simply another kind of monster? So now I ask you, the listener, what do you think of this story? Do you believe Solomon's actions were justified? Or was his revenge simply another form of evil? Was he a martyr of justice, or a murderer who let grief consume his soul? In a world where the law itself was built to protect cruelty, could a man like Solomon be anything other than what he became? The story does not give us easy answers. It is a tale of loss, rage, and impossible choices. But it is also a reminder that history is not only made by kings and generals. Sometimes it is carved into the underside of a coffin lid by a man who refused to suffer quietly. Thank you for walking with us through the haunting legend of Solomon Fairfax. If his story moved you, if it raised questions, stirred anger, or made you reflect, share your thoughts below. Was this justice or was it vengeance? Was Solomon a hero, or was he the very thing he swore to destroy? Your voice becomes part of the legacy, because whether Solomon Fairfax lived as flesh and blood, or survives only in whispers, his story is not really about the past. It is about us, here now, and the choices we make when faced with injustice. So tell us, what do you believe?